Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents No Other Choice by T.L. Payne, narrated by Shawn Compton. Texas is a blend of valor and swagger. Carl Sandburg. Chapter 1. Will. Day 5. Explosions throughout the night had rocked Will Fontenot from the most restful sleep he'd had in the 5 days since the electromagnetic pulse attack. He had at first thought the explosions were the refinery fires reigniting. He'd hoped that was all it was. But the sound of automatic rifle fire poked holes in that theory. He'd chosen to believe that they were safely away from whatever it was, but how long would that last? Will stared through the mosquito netting at the ceiling in Isabella D'Angelo's Houston, Texas apartment. At least the noise from the explosions and gunfire had distracted him from the constant buzzing of dozens of tiny vampires swarming the bed. When the rain from Hurricane Epsilon finally stopped, hordes of mosquitoes had been unleashed like hounds straight from hell. With communications down, Will had no way of knowing how much rain had been dumped on the area, but it was enough to cause significant flooding as predicted. Along with the flooding came the unbearable heat and humidity. With the electric grid destroyed and no way to run the air conditioner, all the apartment windows had been left open. The screens were no match for the blood-sucking creatures. They weren't the only creatures unleashed on them. Every time the door to the apartment opened, swarms of flies launched their invasion. The flies were horrendous. The thought of where they'd been was nauseating. In a city of 2.5 million, and with hundreds of thousands of people stranded on gridlocked evacuation routes attempting to flee Houston, the death toll from the storm was likely immeasurable. Some would have found shelter from the 200 miles per hour winds, only to be inundated by flooding. Downtown high-rises that hadn't burned would likely now be filled with those stranded evacuees. Will had yet to venture out, not wanting to risk exposure to the toxic floodwaters. Still, a few bodies were visible from the third-floor balcony of Isabella's apartment. Will had wanted to shield his 13-year-old son, Caden, from the gruesome sight, but with no one coming to collect the bodies, that wasn't about to happen. For the most part, Will had kept busy planning his and Caden's escape from the city. He had yet to get a chance to speak with Isabella about coming with them. He had planned to approach her the morning after they'd arrived at her apartment. He was looking for a good time to broach the subject, but with her boyfriend around and his bandmates sprawled out on her living room floor, along with the people coming and going from the apartment all day and night, there hadn't been an opportunity. He needed to do it soon, though. He was anxious to heed Kim's and Bethley's warnings and flee Houston as quickly as possible. Will shifted in the bed and winced. His entire body still hurt. His knee was swollen. He had a dinner plate-sized bruise on the left side of his abdomen from the bullet he'd taken to his body armor, and a matching one on the right side from the boot of the guy back at the law office. Will held up his hand and examined his busted knuckles. He wasn't in great shape, but he didn't want to waste time sitting around when he could be out finding the supplies he and Caden would need to make the 150-mile ride to his sister's farm north of Lake Charles, Louisiana. With the waters receding, soon it would be safe to travel, and even though he hadn't had enough time to rest and recover from his battle with the Chinese Communist Party's enforcers, he was planning to head out at their first opportunity. Without a watch and with a cloud-filled sky, he had no idea what time of day it was. He'd been up most of the night pacing the floor, trying to figure out how they'd go about getting out of the city. He'd just settled back down to nap, but his mind had refused to shut off. "Will, we're heading out," Isabella called from the hallway. "Okay, I'll be out in a minute," Will said. The night before, they'd discussed the need to find food. With so many mouths to feed, that would be a monumental task. Will rolled over on the bed to face Caden. "How long was I out?" Caden was seated with his back against the oak headboard. His knees were drawn up to his chest, and in his hands was a paperback book. "Not long, maybe 30 minutes. "Where'd you get the book?" Caden pointed to the nightstand as he flipped a page. "Is it any good?" Caden shook his head. "But you're still reading it?" "I'm bored out of my mind," Caden said. Will hadn't had the time to be bored, but for a 13-year-old who was used to constant external stimulation in the forms of music, video games, and the internet, he imagined the lack of technology would be torture. Will climbed out from under the mosquito netting, threw his legs over the side of the bed, and pulled on his boots. "I'm going out with Isabella. We're going to—" Caden cut him off. "I know, I heard." "You'll be okay here?" "If I say no, will you take me with you?" Will thought for a moment, considering bringing Caden along, and then dismissed the idea. It was too risky. Too much could go wrong. "No, I guess not," Will said. "Anything in particular you'd like me to find for you?" "The internet," Caden said sarcastically. "I wish I could, buddy. I'll keep an eye out for a better book." "Sure." Will wanted to say something, to ask Caden how he was doing emotionally. The words stuck in his throat. He struggled to approach the subject, just as he had all the other times he'd wanted to open a discussion about how his son was coping with things. Caden would say he was fine, like always. Will had no clue how to get him to open up and discuss what he was feeling. He tried to think of what Melanie would have said, but he was not his wife. What Caden needed was his mother, and she wasn't here. Will's face scrunched as he lifted his hands above his head to slip on his tactical vest. He was grateful that Bentley had outfitted him with the gear. He had no idea what or who they would encounter after leaving the apartment, but the equipment would hopefully give him an advantage. Will checked the ammunition in his rifle and pistol and ensured the tactical knife was secured on his belt before grabbing the doorknob. Before turning it, he turned back to Caden. "I won't be long. We're going to check out a few apartments nearby. If you need me, just yell. I'll be able to hear you." Caden let out a heavy sigh. "I know you're not a little kid. I'm just saying, the world has changed. We have to look after each other." Without looking up from his page, Caden shrugged one shoulder and nodded. It was the response Will expected. It was the one he would have given at his age. He kept reminding himself of how awful he was to his parents during his teen years. Will wasn't sure that he could bear it. How was he supposed to know what was Caden being a typical teen and what was him punishing him for killing his mother? His eyes fell to the water bottle sitting on the oak nightstand next to Caden. He pointed to it. "Use a coaster. You'll leave a water ring on the wood. You know better than that. We're guests here. We have to respect other people's things." Caden sighed loudly and snatched the water bottle from the nightstand as Will stepped into the hall and closed the door. Will stepped over the sleeping bodies littering the floor of Isabella's stylishly decorated living room and made his way to the kitchen where Isabella and her live-in boyfriend Kevin were seated at the kitchen island. Kevin's tattooed hands were wrapped around a coffee mug. Sleeve tattoos ran down both muscular arms. Kevin's appearance reminded Will of the drummer from the rock band Nickelback. He had similar colored, light brown hair and chiseled good looks. Will threw him a slight nod as he approached. The smell of rotting meat from the fridge was gone. In its place were several competing aromas emitting from 3 differently scented candles burning around the room. It was almost as bad as the odor from the fridge had been. Isabella swatted a fly on the wall and turned toward Will. "Did you finally get some sleep?" "Some," Will said. He glanced back at Isabella's other house guests, snoozing soundly nearby, and wished he could sleep like that. Isabella yawned and held out a mug. "It's not good, but it's caffeinated." Will took it, smelled the coffee-like substance, and tipped the cup. It was awful, but he needed the pick-me-up, and it would do the trick. He'd had cold coffee before, but it had been brewed first. Soaking coffee grounds in room-temperature water didn't have the same effect. Isabella's cat Otis jumped into the air, attempting to catch one of the giant flies swarming the trash can. To Will's surprise, he caught it in midair. As fat as he was, Will wondered how the black and white feline could move so fast. As Otis moved to his perch on top of the microwave to stare out the window, Will put his empty mug in the sink and joined him. The parking lot below was still covered in knee-deep water, but the sun was out. It was only a matter of time before the water receded and they could be on their way. But first, they needed supplies for a trip across southeast Texas. Will's clothes were still damp from his trek through the floodwaters to Isabella's apartment. His socks were hanging over the back of a chair in her guest room. With the humidity as high as it was, there was little hope of getting his clothes to dry any time soon. He knew that wet feet could lead to all sorts of foot problems, and with the long trip ahead of him, Will had reluctantly borrowed a pair of socks from Kevin. Will stared down at his boots. He didn't want to get the socks wet going back out into the water. His real concern was all the toxic chemicals it would contain. "Can I borrow a couple of trash bags?" Will asked. "Sure, they're under the sink," Isabella said. Will grabbed several, along with a roll of duct tape he found under the sink, climbed onto one of the bar stools, and pulled off his boots. Kevin tilted his head to the side and stared at Will as he slid the black trash bags over his feet and wrapped duct tape around the top, and then pulled his boots back on. He thought about applying the duct tape directly to his skin, but pulling it off would hurt like hell. Maybe if he taped the trash bags up tight enough, he might avoid getting his skin soaked with bacteria, viruses, parasites, and toxic chemicals. It was worth a try. He hoped the water wasn't any deeper than his knees, or it wouldn't work. "That's a great idea," Isabella said. She crossed the room and pulled 2 trash bags from the box. "Can I have some duct tape?" Will cut Isabella 2 lengths of tape and stuck them to the counter. As he was fashioning a bag to carry the finds from the scavenging, Isabella attempted to tape the bags around her thighs. The tape stuck to her fingers, and as she tried to pull it free, one of her acrylic nails popped off. "Damn it," she cursed. "Here, let me," Will said, cutting another strip of tape. He knelt in front of her, wrapping it around her thigh, securing the trash bag to her jeans. When he glanced up, their eyes met. She looked so relaxed and at ease, considering all she'd been through. A smile broke through her lips. The corners of Will's mouth curled up, and he smiled back. He felt the intensity of her gaze, and heat rose behind his cheeks. Kevin cleared his throat, and Will's gaze flicked to him. Kevin puffed out his chest and glared back. The dark blue veins were visible in the man's thick neck. Will stood and backed away from Isabella. "Look, Kevin, isn't this a great idea?" Isabella said, turning to face him. Kevin shrugged. She seemed to be oblivious of her boyfriend's jealousy, or maybe chose to ignore it. Will couldn't. He wasn't about to get into something with the man. He wasn't afraid of a fight, but he wasn't in any shape after the battle he'd been in with the Chinese mafia. He couldn't take the chance of becoming so injured he couldn't make the trip to Louisiana. Kevin furrowed his brow, pushed himself away from the island, and left the room without answering. Isabella was quiet a moment before turning back to Will. "It might help provide some protection against all the nasties in the water, though," Isabella said. "Thanks, Will." She picked up a canvas tote from the counter and headed toward the door. "Are you coming, Kevin?" Kevin sighed and joined her at the door. As the two went outside, Will put the empty milk jug and juice containers they'd been gathering into a trash bag and headed for the stairs. Will, Isabella, Kevin, and a couple from a second-floor apartment gathered on the landing outside Isabella's apartment. The plan was to start on the adjacent building's second-floor apartments and work their way farther and farther out until they found enough to supply them for a few days, or at least all they could carry. After Isabella's initial response to his supply gathering on their way to find shelter from the storm, Will was surprised at her willingness to go into other people's homes to scavenge what they needed to survive now. Will descended the stairs behind Isabella and Kevin. He closed his eyes as the water rose first past his boots and then above his knee, stopping just below the top of the trash bags. So far, so good. His feet were dry. At the bottom of the stairs stood a stocky Hispanic man in his mid-30s and a young, slender Hispanic woman. She was short and attractive, dressed in shorts and a tank top. "Will, this is Gus Ortega and Jacinta Alvarez. Gus is the manager here. He has the keys, so we won't have to break down any doors," Isabella said. Gus gave Will a nod and then pointed to Will's legs. "Smart." Chapter 2. Betley, Day 5. After arriving at Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base, FBI agent James Betley had been escorted into the medical clinic to have his wounds taken care of. His leg hurt even worse after being cleaned and stitched. The doctor had given him a local, but that wore off after an hour, and the doc was unwilling to provide Betley with anything stronger than ibuprofen for the pain. Betley assumed that was because he hadn't been interviewed yet. They'd want him clear-headed for the questioning. Betley just wanted some relief and a little sleep. Was that too much to expect? At least he'd been given a clean change of clothes to wear. After his visit at the clinic, Betley had been taken to an office deep in the heart of a Coast Guard's multi-story building. Hours passed as he waited to brief the Central Intelligence Agency officials about what had occurred with his informant Kim Yang. He'd fallen asleep with his head resting on the desk. He jumped when the door finally opened. A tall and slender woman, Betley guessed to be in her early 30s, rounded the desk and took a seat in the faux leather office chair. "Agent James Betley, I'm Analyst Rachel Stevens," she said. Betley straightened, ran a hand through his dark brown hair, and wiped the drool from his mouth with his sleeve. As Stevens gathered pen and paper, Betley looked her over. Her brown hair was kept in a tight bun. She was a strikingly attractive woman, even without makeup. Betley shot her his lady-killer smile, but from her body language, she was all business. "I've been reviewing the material on the flash drive you claim to have received from your informant, Kim Yang," Stevens continued. Betley had conducted enough interrogations to recognize her technique. She was playing the skeptic, putting distance between their roles and attempting to throw him off balance. Betley tried his best to look relaxed, but his neck and shoulders were stiff. He placed his palms on his thigh and inhaled and exhaled slowly. "And what did you find?" he asked. He expected her to tell him it was classified and refused to give specifics. After all, he lacked the clearance for the level of information Kim claimed would be on the flash drive. "Well, Miss Yang did a very good job of documenting the theft of petroleum refining trade secrets," Stevens said. Betley raised an eyebrow. Why would Kim's reports on corporate espionage be on the drive? That was unexpected. Perhaps she'd made a copy of the thumb drive she took from Hui Shi and Shan Huang. He stared at the backs of his bruised hands. The image of the member of the Chinese mafia who'd stabbed him in the leg flashed before him. The man had wanted that drive pretty badly to have followed them through a raging hurricane even after Kim had been killed. "Why don't you tell me why it is that you believe that Kim Yang had information pertaining to the attack we've experienced and a possible insurgency? That is what you told Lieutenant Sharp, is it not?" "That is what Kim Yang told me," Betley said. After he'd described what Kim had told him as far as he could recall, Stevens stood and walked to the door. "Wait here. I'll be back," she said. Betley waited, and then waited some more. He had never been on this side of an interrogation, and he didn't like it, not one bit. Maybe Stevens needed to be reminded that they were both on the same side. Betley was weak from blood loss and weary from battling the Chinese mafia that had come after Kim. He needed food, real food, and a shower. After those things and some sleep, he'd be much more helpful to Stevens. The fact that she'd chosen to treat him like an adversary instead of a colleague had him concerned. Had Kim played him? Had she lied about what she'd found? But what about the blueprints and schematics of the power plant and pipelines leading to the Houston ship channel? Those were not part of Kim's work at the refinery. And why would they send mafia goons if they didn't believe she had something significant? There was a knock on the door, and then a soldier appeared. "Please come with me, Agent Betley." "Why? Where am I going?" "I was instructed to escort you to the skiff," the soldier said. Being allowed into the sensitive compartmented information facility was a step forward. Perhaps they would now read him in on what else they'd found on Kim's flash drive. A man in a white button-down shirt, black slacks, and red tie greeted him at the door. "Agent Betley?" Betley nodded. "I'm Analyst Warren. If you'll come in here, we just have a few more questions, and then we'll let you get some rest." The analyst led Bentley down a short hall. At the end was a soldier standing guard in front of a single steel door. Analyst Warren showed the soldier his badge, and the soldier opened the door, closing it immediately after Bentley and the analyst stepped into the vestibule. Steel mesh lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The analyst then opened a second interior door. The interior walls and ceiling were lined with acoustical panels. The padding provided soundproofing between the skiff and the outside. The space was a lot smaller than Bentley had imagined it would be. Stevens was hovering over a man seated in front of a computer screen. She glanced up, nodded toward a chair in the corner, and returned her attention to the screen. "You're sure?" Stevens asked the man. "That is all that's here," he replied. Stevens turned her attention to Bentley as Warren spread a stack of papers out on a table in the middle of the room. "Tell me again how Kim came into possession of the blueprints for the power plant and the Houston ship channel pipelines?" she asked. "She said she stole them from Huang's safe. When she entered the room, Huang shoved a duffel under his desk and out of view. Before being suddenly called away, he placed the bag into his safe and hurried from the room." "And Kim knew the combination to Huang's safe?" Warren asked. "She'd watched him unlock it several times to retrieve cash he was paying her for stolen trade secrets," Bentley said. "And Kim somehow managed to get the duffel out of his house, and that's when she contacted you?" Stevens asked. "She contacted me from her car moments before the EMP. She said she was being followed, so they knew she'd taken it," Bentley said. "Here's our problem, Bentley. There's nothing on that drive related to an insurgency or targets they plan to hit. Having the schematic in your possession lends validity to your claim, but we need the other memory device. We have sent our people back out to the storage facility to try to locate it, but they came back empty-handed. I need you to walk me through it again. Don't leave anything out. I need to know Kim's every move from the moment she called you until she was killed. Can you do that for me?" Bentley's head ached by the time he'd recounted every moment he could account for. "Once the Chinese mafia showed up, things got crazy pretty fast. I can't say where she went from the time she left my unit until she was shot." "And the 3 civilians that were with you on the bridge, they were present when Kim Yang was shot?" "Yes," Bentley said. "Sharp said the girl gave you her address." "She did," Bentley said. "Why would she do that?" Warren asked. Bentley glanced from Stevens to Warren, then back to Stevens. "Because I'm a handsome son of a bitch." Chapter 3. Will. Day 5. Gus led the group across the courtyard and up the stairs to the apartments which he was sure weren't occupied. As Will stepped into the deeper water, his pants legs became soaked. He lifted his leg above water and cursed under his breath. Pieces of debris had poked holes in the bags. What he would give for a good pair of waders. Will waited at the bottom of the stairs as Gus and his girlfriend went up to confirm that no one was home. Isabella pulled her thin jacket tight against her as a light rain began to fall. Her boyfriend just looked bored or stoned. Maybe both. "Jazz, hold that flashlight while I open the curtains," Gus said, disappearing inside an apartment. A moment later, Gus reappeared in the doorway. "All clear," he called. Before Will even stepped inside, he knew no one was home. There'd be no way anyone could have stood the smell that emanated from the place. With the electricity out, the items in the refrigerator had spoiled, and the odor was unbearable, almost as bad as the smell of Isabella's bathroom. Will headed for the laundry closet in the hall where the hot water heater was located. He pulled his shirt up over his nose, and after filling the 2 milk jugs for him and Caden, he filled the 2-liter soda bottles and then the 16-ounce water bottles. "If there are any containers that we can carry water in, I need those," Will called into the kitchen. Kevin appeared with a couple of empty orange juice jugs. "Are they finding much food?" Will asked. "Yeah, but I doubt we'll ever see any of it," Kevin said. "That's not nice," Isabella whispered as she walked up behind him. "Whatever, you'll see," Kevin said. Kevin disappeared into the bathroom across the hall. Will heard cabinets opening and closing.
There's nothing wrong with Gus and Jazz. They'll share whatever they find. Kevin just doesn't like them for some reason, Isabella said.
Maybe we should split up just in case, Will said. He had no way of knowing if Kevin was right or not, but he hadn't come outside and taken the risk just to go away empty-handed.
I don't know. If you want to, that's fine, I guess, Isabella said.
Will handed her 2 jugs of water and headed for the door. I'm going to check out the one across the hall. That's Mr. Hernandez. I don't know if he's home or not. I didn't get an answer when I knocked before the storm, but he's hard of hearing, Gus said.
He doesn't have a car or any way to evacuate. How would he leave? Jazz pointed out. I thought I saw a light in his window last night. We should check on him then, right? Isabella suggested.
She banged on the door. If the man were in there and alive, he'd have to be totally deaf not to have heard her. She stood back and waited. He didn't answer.
I think we should go in and make sure that if he's in there, he's all right.
Gus jingled keys, finally located the one he was looking for, and inserted it into the lock. Before Gus could even turn the knob, the door opened. A face appeared in the crack. Not Mr. Hernandez. "Who are you?" Gus asked. His tone was not friendly. Will stepped to the side and placed his hand on his holstered pistol.
"Who the hell are you?"
the pretty young woman asked. "I'm the apartment manager. Where's Mr. Hernandez?" Gus asked. She looked back over her shoulder into the room.
"He's sleeping."
"Wake him up," Gus demanded. Will didn't like where this was headed. Gus's reaction seemed a bit extreme. But he knew the old man. Will didn't. A man's head appeared above the woman's. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but you need to leave," he said, slamming the door in Gus's face.
"I think we should go, Gus,"
Jazz said, tugging on her boyfriend's arm.
"Something ain't right in there, Jazz. You know it and I know it. Hernandez doesn't have family nearby. Those folks are up to something," Gus said.
"She's right," Kevin said. "Let's mind our own business and get back to finding food." Gus wheeled around and got in Kevin's face.
"Listen here, you do what you like, but I'm getting inside that apartment and finding out what the hell is going on in there."
Will was torn. His gut told him something wasn't right with the couple, but on the other hand, they weren't cops. And there wouldn't be any backup coming if they got into something with them. As much as he would like to help, Will just couldn't risk not making it back to his son. Will stepped around Gus, Jazz, and Isabella and walked next door. "What about this one? Are they home?" Jazz shook her head.
"Give them the keys, Gus."
Gus ignored her and shoved the key back into Mr. Hernandez's door and pushed it open.
"Holy hell, what the—"
Jazz stepped through the door and screamed. Isabella pulled her pistol from its holster and moved to the side of the door.
"What is it?"
she called. Will rushed over and flanked the opposite side of the doorframe. He didn't like it. The couple could shoot through the thin walls, no problem.
"What did you do to him?"
Gus asked.
"He's old. He died in his sleep," the man said.
The girl was crying hysterically. Will stepped through the door. An elderly man was lying on a sofa in his pajamas. Except for the odor, Will would have thought he was sleeping. He covered his mouth and nose with his arm and backed out the door. He waited for the others on the steps where the air was somewhat better.
"They're going to come back with us. They can't stay here with that body," Isabella said.
"What?" Will asked. It was her apartment. It wasn't up to him, but he had no clue where she thought she would put 2 more people. They could barely move in there as it was. 10 people in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment would be bad with electricity. Without it, it'd be unbearable.
"They're going to stay in the apartment across from Gus and Jazz. I think he wants to be able to keep an eye on them," Isabella said.
"Okay, what about the food? Are we still searching the rest of the vacant apartments or what?"
"Will,"
Gus said, tossing him a set of keys.
"They're for that building there."
Gus pointed to the building on their right.
No one should be home in those units. What are you guys doing? Will asked.
We're taking these two back to our unit, and then we'll catch up with you, Jazz said.
The young woman glanced.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?